My name is Genevieve Johnson. I'm the coordinator for the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and we are hosting this webinar series as part of a partnership with the World Wildlife Fund and the South Central Climate Science Center, as well as others who have provided input and providing science in the Rio Grande Basin, getting ready for a forum that we're planning on hosting in November. Today we are lucky to have Jack Friedman. He's a research scientist at the Center for Applied Social Research from the University of Oklahoma, an anthropologist with experience in looking at a broad spectrum of different types of information and working with people in the field. And he has partnered with Stephanie Paladino, also from the University of Oklahoma, who's an environmental anthropologist. And she has worked specifically in the Rio Grande, in Mexico and the U.S., focusing on environmental problems and things that folks have in common as they relate to questions of equity and governance and sustainability. Today, one of the projects that they are in the process of completing is understanding how to manage scarce water during drought, which, as all of you know, is a great challenge in the Rio Grande Basin. Severe drought coupled with human development has had an impact on the quantity and quality of water, and so this presentation summarizes findings from 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork with hundreds of stakeholders and people who manage water in the basin, specifically focusing on 10 sections of the basin, from the origins of the Rio Grande in Colorado down to the Gulf of Mexico. Broadly, this information will help inform how different human and environmental factors affect the Rio Grande in order to identify how management strategies and human uses of the river can be better coordinated. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jack and Stephanie.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. So just to start with, the title is slightly different. Rather than stakeholders, I think I just wanted to use a broader term and just say social perspectives. There are reasons for that, but I'll just dive into this rather than getting too academic about these things. And I really want to begin our presentation with sort of two snapshots from our ethnographic research on water management. Each of these are what I would sort of term a slightly contrasting view of the human use of water. And this first one comes from a New Mexico farmer who said, I can't tell you how many times I've been interviewed and someone's asked me, well, why would pecans be allowed to be planted in this great numbers in a drought and with these limited water resources? And one of my pat responses is, because this isn't the Soviet Union. I mean, if people can do what they want to do. You can contrast that sort of a view with a slightly different view, which comes from a municipal water manager who we interviewed, who said, and so we're putting out a lot of information to our customers about not using too much water, and I got a call from an elderly man in the middle of the summer. It was July, it was 95 degrees, and he said he wasn't going to turn on his swamp cooler if it was going to put us over the amount of water we should use. And the swamp cooler uses something like 20 gallons of water a day, but he was thinking about the fact that we didn't have that much, and he didn't want to be the one to push us over. And I use that as an example of people here, about what they're like. And you talk to people here about what's needed, and that's the response we get. People who are individually concerned with their own particular small piece of our total use. Now, it would be easy to judge these two narratives on some moral ground or something like that as good or bad. But really for us, it's more important to understand where these narratives come from and what they mean for people and how they influence management behavior. So today, we'll report on some of our ethnographic findings related to the study of water managers. And I should stress at this point, we use the term water managers very broadly. And basically what we're looking at is anybody who manages a whole lot of water. What we did not do in our study is look at sort of endpoint water users as individuals in a city or in a town or something like this, but we did include many farmers, agriculture folks. Anybody who's managing a lot of water is sort of our main goal here. So we're studying water managers along the length of the Rio Grande Bravo. Our project, which explicitly considers how human factors interacting with the Rio Grande impact conservation, was guided by 3 core questions. So what shapes decision-making and water management practices in the subregions of the Rio Grande, and how do these interact with each other to help solve or create fragmentation in the basin as a whole? 2, what role does whole river thinking play in water managers' decision-making practices or ideas? And 3, what flexibility or constraints do managers have in making decisions that affect sustainability and resilience of the river system? So I'll do a very short methodology discussion here because I want to get onto the guts of this. Broadly, our research is based on 15 months of in situ ethnographic field work in the Rio Grande Basin, and this includes in Mexico's Rio Conchas Basin. We directly interviewed over 120 water managers from across the entire region, and these included municipal managers, federal managers, irrigation districts, farmers, recreation, tribal, as well as a number of other folks. And instead of these were not simply us diving in and doing an interview over an hour or over a telephone. These tended to combine both interviews and a great deal of participant observation, which meant that we spent on average between 4 and 8 hours, but I can tell you that at least one person on this call right now spent days and days and days with one of us. These really were deeper dives than a simple short interview with somebody. Just as a brief sort of snapshot of kinds of the themes that we asked in our interviews, the recorded interviews, we asked a lot about background information, so personal and professional, really to frame kind of where this person was coming from in the first place. Observed changes in the climate or what they were seeing throughout their life or their experiences that might address kind of the issue of stressors on the system. Local and institutional memories of drought. What do folks say about such and such about drought in this area? Descriptions of their work or their decision making and changes in that work over time, and this was really a major focus of the interviews. And my work, this obviously includes everything from people who are water managers to a farmer. So it was that broad. And then a lot of drought-specific questions. How do you know you're in a drought? Tell me about a specific drought you experienced, things like that. Our interviews were very open-ended, so we did not have a highly structured interview. Just from the snapshot of interviews themselves, this is kind of a graphic of the representation that we had. So we literally hit every county that borders the Rio Grande in the U.S., and then we had a much more concentrated field research window that we could do work in the Conchos, and so had a combination of group interviews as well as individual interviews divided over sort of three regions. So that's sort of the background here. So much of this study is really driven by concerns over the impacts of and the possibilities to overcome deeply entrenched fragmentation and segmentation of the management of the river. So what I'm going to describe next are things that, for those of you who do the Rio Grande, will probably appear very familiar. But these were things we really came into this project with an inductive set of methods. We wanted to see what people had to say about them. So even though we'll touch on general themes that you're familiar with, in many ways, how we approach this and how we gather data it was really bottom up rather than top down. We talk about 5 different types of fragmentation here that emerged really in our work. And the first and probably the most obvious one is what we term hydrological fragmentation. And to be perfectly honest, and again, I saw that he's on this call, you know, we were heavily influenced by the term hydrological resets or resetting of the hydrology, which we borrowed from Jack Schmidt, because it's a wonderful way of describing this, and also it's a way that I think a lot of other people who we talked to described it. But this is really the idea that it's pretty much impossible to do the hydrology of the Rio Grande without looking at every single impoundment on the river, causing you to reset how you're approaching that hydrological modeling or hydrological studies. And so this is a snapshot of, obviously, the major dams that are impacting the river, and there's a number of other things that we could have included here in terms of diversions, things like that. But just to give a sense of how broken up this river can seem at times, this is a sort of a nice snapshot of the major dams. But why would we go over this old ground, which any hydrologist knows who's studied this region, except for the fact that really from a social standpoint, it had a great deal of importance for us. And really what it came down to is we heard over and over again from everybody across the river this narrative about the two Rio Grandes argument. And this is just one snapshot that we heard. So somebody who says, we have a great deal of interest in Colorado because that's the source of our water. But really, with the compacts and the treaties and the obligations, really we don't think of it as a unified whole. It's really not. It's separate individual management areas with various requirements to deliver a certain amount of water to the next downstream. Really, there's two Rio Grandes, and for this person, it's North Rio Grande that ends at Fort Quitman, and South Rio Grande starting up south of that. The person ends this story, though, in a nice way when he says that we've taken a tour all the way to the very headwaters of the Rio Grande, the very summit, the very swale at the very top where the Rio Grande actually begins. That there was actually snow there. It was the middle of summer, and it was melting, and it was trickling down the hill. We all spat in it and wished Texas well. So this is from a New Mexico water manager. I certainly hope that if you all had your microphones on right now, you'd be laughing. Because this actually leads nicely into sort of the second obvious fragmentation, which is a political or jurisprudential fragmentation, with 8 state borders, 1 international border, having to deal with state water laws that are different, interstate water agreements that are different, international water agreements that are different, all of which we saw represented in multiple ways, but one of the most obvious ways was a series of cascading animosities. And again, for those of you who study the region, you see this every day. Colorado complains about New Mexico. They have to deliver all this water to New Mexico. New Mexico complains about Texas. Southern Texas complains about Mexico and the U.S. federal government a great deal, that they're not getting their fair share of water. And so this is a snapshot from one of our interviews from the lower Rio Grande Valley. So this is the South Texas region, where somebody says, I tell you that what's disheartening for the valley is that they lean towards the Mexico side more than us. It's like I said, the federal government right now works against us. They don't ever take our sides. Mexico has all of these 20 dams up there, and they're holding all of their water for these huge ag deals they put in. There's a whole new area of agriculture in the Rio Conchos in Mexico. All of this has been done in the last 20, 30 years, and these dams have all been put in. And so they hold all of that water, and they won't treat us as a user on the downside. We heard similar things, though I don't think quite as contentious from the Conchos Basin, where we heard from a lot of the people who we were interviewing that they certainly feel pressured by treaty obligations with the U.S., but often they're also feeling just as much pressure from other Mexican states in terms of supplying water. The response, though, often was slightly different than what we were hearing on the U.S. side. Irrigators believed that they should be compensated for lost crops due to water curtailments, or to get more government investment in efficiency. On both sides of the border, though, I can say that pretty much everybody was saying that they wanted more effective monitoring and enforcement of water diversions by irrigators, because to a great extent, everybody believes that this would relieve pressures during droughts, despite obviously the logistical and the political implications and difficulties connected to this. A third part of this story that we're telling is one that it's less about fragmentation and more about the segmentation of management challenges. And I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but in essence, if we imagine that one of our goals is to try and think the whole river, it becomes particularly difficult when thinking through natural resource management or managing for instance, endangered or threatened ecosystems or species, especially when looking across such a dramatically diverse cluster of ecoregions in the Rio Grande basin broadly. You can imagine the management challenges that folks would face if they did have to put together a cluster of useful policies that dealt with this as a whole river system. And yet, at the same time, there obviously are some things that are prompting specific, often sub-basin responses. The Rio Grande silvery minnow has led to significant responses in certain regions of the river. So I show this picture up here in the top left that is of a water gauge in the stream gauge in the center of Albuquerque that's used to monitor flow at that spot. And the folks in Albuquerque who I talked to tended to stress that this was one of the added values for this was that it was providing environmental flow, even though that was never mandated in anything that Albuquerque does, something that we'll discuss in a minute. So the sort of fourth idea about fragmentation that that's emerged out of our research is really sort of fragmentation in terms of human use of the river itself. Agriculture, if it's not on the table for thinking about solving problems, you won't actually have a solution, given that agriculture consumes between 85 and 90% of the water in the Rio Grande. And no water has been formally, legally set aside for ecosystem-oriented management, but there are very interesting ways in which it actually has been set aside. And so somewhere between agriculture and the environment are municipalities, which consume anywhere from 10 to 15% of the water. Obviously, how the water is used in different places is dramatically different. Everything from flooding fields to irrigate crops, to the traditional acequia systems, surface irrigation, and I'm going to linger here for an extra second or two, just so everybody can admire that bottom left picture, because it is a very pretty picture. And then sprinkler irrigation also throughout the contrast. And again, here I would emphasize the difference in sort of technological in technology that's being used. Everything from wheel irrigation in the top right image, which is basically a 1950s irrigation technology, to very advanced drip irrigation in the bottom right. Sprinkler irrigation. And as I said before, the sort of the role of municipalities is critical, especially with the idea of growth of municipalities. It's one thing in the northern parts of the river, but it's something that is present almost every single day in discussions about water and the river in particular in the lower Rio Grande Valley, where municipal growth is shocking. It's the growth of population down there. Finally, when we're talking about fragmentation, one of the things that emerged out of our work is what we ended up terming cognitive fragmentation. And here really what we're talking about is kind of how people do or don't think about the region. I've sort of termed this compact cognition in the sense that people will break up the way that they look at the world or the way that they think that they can do things in the world based on treaties, on compacts, on rules, on the law of the land. But also it has a double meaning in that compact means it's smaller and it's a sort of a small example of something larger. As such, one of the things we noticed was that there really is little significant occurrence of whole river thinking in actual real world management practice. Now, that is different than what we will talk about later on. And I just want to stress that it's real world management practice. So I always like to do this very briefly for those of you who maybe don't know the Rio Grande super well. I think it's a fun little exercise, which is to ask a simple question. If you look at this map, where is the upper Rio Grande, where's the middle Rio Grande, where's the lower Rio Grande? And so I will show a few pictures. And the question is the lower Rio Grande study is a thing. Where is that lower Rio Grande study on this map? Well, of course, the lower Rio Grande study is there. Of course, the middle Rio Grande Conservancy District is here, a little closer to the middle, but it really is the middle of New Mexico. And the upper Rio Grande Loop, I assume you all know that it's going to be in Colorado somewhere, and it's of course there. And all of this is just a little bit lighthearted, but at the same time it drives home the fact that these compacts and sort of geographical space and what's considered local often ends up defining how people think about the river. So this idea of compact cognition, we defined as describing a way of thinking about water problem solutions and dynamics defined by the confines of the formal rules set by interstate and international compacts that set the requirements for water releases from one geographical and or political region to another. How does this affect water managers themselves? For the most part, managers expressed it. They didn't think that their capacity, or they thought that their capacity to make free-thinking decisions was highly constrained by these rules that they worked in. Managers believed that obligation to maximize consumption or beneficial use of water, which leads to a peculiar way of seeing problems in managing resources shaped by a number of tensions. These include water rights, narratives about zero-sum competition. So if I don't use it to maximize production, someone else will, and their success will lead to my loss. Use it or lose it narratives. If we use less than we have the right to, we might lose our right to it in the future. Feast or famine narratives. If we don't use it all, whether efficiently or not, during the times when we get water, then we might fail during times when we're facing a drought or reduced water availability. And of course, as we saw earlier, the two rivers argument ultimately is a good example of how people make sense of hydrology in this case, and say things like, I don't have to worry about the whole Rio Grande too far south because it dries up in the middle. It's really two rivers. So, implications and conclusions of our study. While we've talked about managers in a certain way up till now, One of the things that we noticed in our work was that common assumptions about managers are simply wrong. The common assumption is that managers are simply implementers of policy. And this is often reinforced by explicit statements by the managers themselves. So it is not uncommon to hear a manager say, well, I do what my job says, my job description tells me to do. But the reality is far more complex, with managers often having substantial wiggle room, while at the same time having enough cover that they can deny this flexibility under normal situations. And it really is that wiggle room that I think is a critical thing to identify and to think about in water management, in the real world implementation of water management. However, at the same time, most water managers are fully aware of the tensions that they're working in. So one municipal water manager put it this way: unfortunately, the job that I have, which centers on conservation and preservation of the resource, ultimately feeds into my desire to have water exist just for itself, just to be there. There are times when what I'm doing for work doesn't exactly follow my own personal desire for in-stream flow, for instance. That's not something the municipality I work for works on because it's not recognized as a beneficial use. We can't give our water away for in-stream flows. That's not something we can do. This is water owned by our customers. It's for our customers. So those issues I don't always get to work on. We heard similar tensions from folks in the Rio Grande region, where many of the actors recognized concepts like ecosystem services and environmental flow and placed high value on them, but at the same time, addressing these issues are not described as within official roles or institutional missions. At the same time, though, we saw interesting cases where irrigation units that divert water directly from the river have an interest in restoring aspects of sort of natural ecosystems, or at least natural channel flow and bank. Their mission is to do this to improve water flow and quality, but at the same time, they acknowledged that there were sort of benefits to the ecosystem and environmental flow. I think one of the larger challenges, though, that all of these sort of hopeful things ran up against was the fact that sort of the river as an ecosystem is not within the mission or the mandate of Conagua, and a lot of the irrigation managers were employees of or connected to Conagua. But what are these sort of workarounds and what I term the wiggle room factor? What are the things that we saw in our work? Some of them just involved somewhat surprising and unexpected things. Local farmers and ranchers in Colorado's San Luis Valley were supporting these significant river restoration projects in the headwaters. And the way one of them put it was, the water users around here are also the environmentalists, and that's not the case everywhere. Now, I don't really have any advice for people because, you know, here if we just explained to you what we did, I would wager that you would probably say we're an environmental organization. But our goal is to do river restoration, improve the health of the river. Our board is farmers and ranchers. Sort of a second example of this sort of working around the rules occurs with sort of south of Elephant Butte Dam. So all surface water rights below Elephant Butte Dam were appropriated for agriculture. But at the present, there are new policies that are allowing water use for environmental restoration to happen without invoking legal change of use. And they're doing this by redefining watering of restoration plants as irrigation. So again, nothing major changed in the say water rights system itself, but there was this workaround. Finally, we saw plenty of federal level managers who sort of unofficially doing things. Unofficially timing, for instance, required water releases from dams to maximize environmental benefits. And this next quote is an example of that, where somebody said, we have to move a certain quantity of water from reservoir 1 down to reservoir 2 by law, so we can't get around doing that. So we're trying to do it in a way that minimizes the impact of the stream system. There's a good brown trout fishery up there. So it's past recreation time, but we're trying to do it in a way that minimizes the impact of that fishery. And then X County has a power plant on Reservoir 1 that they've been working on, and they're trying to recommission it. So we're also working with them to get them the kind of flows that they need to test it. So like all these people are benefiting. So we want to wrap up with just a couple of slides here and really kind of get back to what I think of as often the core of our project, which is whole river thinking, thinking about the river, again, from headwaters all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the headwaters in the Conchos. Is this possible? And the reality is we kind of have two, not entirely incompatible, they're very compatible sort of findings on this. And one perspective is from the Conchos. And in this case, what we really see as a benefit for thinking the whole river is the fact that institutionally water management is relatively centralized, which some people might not think of as a good thing, but in this case, it can be very good because it can help build broader basin knowledge and integrate multiple scales and levels of management under one institution. And one of the interesting things that we heard also, which is sort of a side point, was that irrigation district heads are required to rotate to different districts throughout their career. And so you get irrigation district folks who actually have a wider perspective in terms of basin and sub-basin dynamics. The second point I'm going to hand off to Stephanie very quickly, and then I'll jump back on and we'll wrap up in a few minutes.
Hi there. So the second point was just extending that since so much of water management in Mexico is under this institution, federal institution, but one spin-off of that is that national law mandates that there be a basin council for all of the major rivers, and so there is one for the Rio Grande basin, and that is has different representatives of major water users in it and government agencies, and is undertaking, for instance, modeling of the basin. There's an effort going on to model the whole basin to guide decision making. It's a forum for coordination amongst different water user interests, and it's also engaged in actually translating national law into basin-specific regulations. So, in a sense, that's one potential spin-off of, having this kind of centralized or federal agency be so involved that they're able to mandate this.
Having said that, we obviously ran into some challenges, though, in terms of this whole river thinking. The reality is that local regional water managers expressed no practical reason to focus on the Rio Grande above the confluence of the Conchos and the Rio Grande. And there's sparse knowledge exchange within the water sectors themselves. And yet, at the same time, there are some hopeful things. People in the U.S., Mexico border region, especially with ties to farming and to multi-generational presence in the area, often have much broader geographic and historical perspectives on the Rio Grande, including up through New Mexico and all the way down to the Gulf. And also, we found a lot of hope in binational projects because they really have brought together a number of different actors on both sides and really sort of force the issue of thinking about the river much outside of sort of local constraints. On the U.S. side, we actually kind of saw the flip side when it came to water management itself, because water management is relatively decentralized, distributed among many agencies and actors, which really can reinforce overly regionalized and localized perspectives. As we heard from one Southern Colorado interviewee, we actually know more about the other rivers in our state than we do about the rest of the Rio Grande Basin. Having said that, though, interestingly enough, we heard a lot of hopeful things. The interstate and binational agreements, which are often viewed as being things that contribute to fragmentation, are also things that knit together basin segments, so leading to the possibility of new ways of thinking about the river. There are increasing initiatives at broader regional scales, so the sort of sub-basin efforts toward water management. We saw a lot of that connected to groundwater and surface water management across a much broader scales. Networks and exchanges within and across sectors and between professional and non-professional water managers have been sort of a critical, I think, strength that we identified as providing a possible platform for this whole river thinking. Most of our interviewees have extensive experience or knowledge of other parts of the basin that you can build on. And there are some really strong networks of water people and water organizations, especially across New Mexico and southern Colorado. They're a little bit more dispersed in Texas. I think with that, I'm not sure if I'm at 30 minutes. I probably am over it, but we'll wrap up. This is our acknowledgements. We're happy to take questions or comentarios.
Did everyone fall asleep?
You should be, let's see, Sarah, did you unmute everybody so they can ask directly?
Yes, I just unmuted everybody, so
okay.
You should be able to.
Any questions?
This is Alfredo Rodriguez from the Rio Grande, Mexico. You listen to me?
Yes, we hear you, Alfredo.
Excellent. So basically, what I would like to, to confirm or not, that if there is a possibility for all actors to consider just one basin as a whole, you know, as a binational whole large basin, because you set up that question, but I am not totally, I'm not sure if I get it straightforward.
Are you asking whether it's realistic even to think about?
That's correct, Stephanie.
Okay. Oh, hi there, by the way. Well, that's in some ways a question I would turn back to all, but I think I don't. You know, somebody asked me a question in a presentation once, and where they were wondering if we should actually be advocating, you know, government takeover of the whole thing and get it to work together. And I don't think it's that. I think it's just how do we get that wider perspective so we actually see how what's going on in regions and segments of the river actually affect what's going on in the system as a whole, upstream and downstream. And I don't know if you can add something. I mean, that's kind of how I would respond to it.
So I would add that one of the challenges is precisely this question of whether or not we can mention it. It's not whether or not it is it's actually possible. Of course, it is possible. But it would require an enormous change. So we're doing this mostly. Anybody is doing this. Anybody is at it in these terms, or whether or not, and to show as empirically as we can what the problem. Business as usual.
And I think I wanted to add that part of the goal also was to look for what are people doing that shows examples of thinking in broader terms. Not just thinking about it, but actually trying to practice in terms of, we talked about fragmentation as a geographic thing, or however you want to look at it, the sort of diversity or segmentation. We talked about the way that political jurisdictions divide up the basin, but we also maybe didn't emphasize as much right now is the problem that's true in both countries, that different aspects of the river, different aspects of the river that require governance, whether it's in the uplands, in the watershed, whether it's rangelands, whether it's aquatic life, or whether it's water supply or water quality, they all tend to be dispersed, distributed among lots of different agencies. And so that's another area where we're kind of looking at how do you, where can this all come together, or aspects of it come together? And so what we were seeing was many instances on what we referred to as sub-basin or sub-regional, or segments of the river where actually what I would say are kind of baby steps, or first steps towards a broader perspective where people are doing it on a segment or a sub-regional basis in the river. So people are doing things like there's more instance of initiatives where there are attempts to planning in ways that bring different water user sectors together, so that we found lots of instances of regional water planning. Different the pipeline itself could be seen as an instance of, okay, we have to think bigger. That was one of our points, and there's sort of a forum there for it. We also found these instances of people thinking about their sub-region. It's not the best word, but they're sort of segment of the basin, if you will. Like, how do we also bring groundwater and water into surface water or groundwater? So these various attempts within regions to kind of bring some of those different water and management questions together on different levels. And I think that's really significant. Also, I'd mentioned just instances of people doing projects in ways that try to meet the needs of different users. So, whether it's meeting irrigators, recreation folks, and, habitat folks' needs, or, the needs of the river habitat. So to me, that's pretty significant that there are instances of that can serve to some extent as steps towards, learning and how do you practice on a larger level.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
I don't know if that answers it, but I'll let someone else ask a question.
Great. Other questions? Well, Jack and Stephanie, I actually have one question, which I would just like to hear from you both what you think the most interesting thing is that you discovered from talking to all of these folks, and also maybe if you had some recommendations for how to use this type of information moving forward.
Gosh, just one interesting thing?
You can say more than one.
Well, for me, I think that it's less an interesting thing than an interesting region, which is so we knew coming into this study, if you go through a lot of the scholarship that's out there, just how much is written on and how much is focused on basically kind of the northern parts of the Rio Grande. I was really interested, I was really committed to this idea that we do the whole thing, and so I spent a lot of time down in the lower Rio Grande Valley. And I think what was most interesting to me was to see just how dramatically different the context is down there, and how so few people actually know about that region in the northern parts. Again, it reinforced what I saw over and over again, which is this real kind of fragmentation of how people are thinking about the river. But the history down there, the way water is used, it's the whole world down there, and that to me was one of the more surprising and interesting things. And I think I would also say that the particular examples that we heard from a lot of folks about this wiggle room issue. Every time somebody would say something about this, saying, well, you know, formally this is what I do, and they'd spend an hour telling us about all of the formal stuff that they do in their work, and then they would suddenly turn around and say, but you know, this is how we make it all. This is how I sleep at night. I sleep at night because somewhere in the work that I do, I can squeeze in this thing to make sure that there's water in a stream where I know that there are fish, or to, you know, make sure that water moves its way in such and such a place that I really wasn't mandated to do this, but I could still do it, kind of under the radar, but nobody really objected or would object to it. And those things, I think, were really important things to identify and to see. And each time they happened, kind of things became a little lighter in my world, because all of the challenges connected to this to the Rio Grande can feel a bit heavy at times.
And I'd go with to add that I think I guess these experiments that are going on, you know, including with things like water banking or different ways of defining access to water, you know, a lot of things that would be familiar to folks that work in the basin in one way or another. I mean, I think identifying those and being able to talk, you know, point to sort of some of the experiences. You know, we may not be able to document in detail the experiences of all those, but to be able to point those out and, you know, point the way to these experiences so that that kind of learning can happen, I think, is also, for actual water managers, people in the trenches, that's pretty significant. So there are a lot of things we didn't mention that are being, you know, sort of experiments, if you will, in water management, and I think there are significant opportunities to learn. And I will say that people really care a lot. That really comes through. I think that reinforces what Jack was saying, and that is encouraging. And gosh, I forgot what the second part of the point was. Oh well, it'll come back after y'all go away, but when I'm driving home. I can't remember, but I just think there's a lot that's going on that's pushing the envelope now, and it's important to look at those.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Lindsay Bass from Rural Wildlife Fund. I lead our corporate water stewardship work, and we work in the basin with several partners, and I was just curious, in the work that you all have done, it is interesting to hear that, you know, there are these little pockets of innovation happening, but kind of the fragmentation, this jurisdictional fragmentation, you know, leads to this opportunity to help connect the dots. So that's one takeaway that's, I think, really encouraging from our side, to get some of these innovators, you know, into broader forums to share what they're doing. But I'd also wanted to ask you guys whether or not, in your interviews, folks talked about the relative level of pain and impact they'd felt through the drought. We've done some discussions on our side as well in terms of trying to understand, you know, given some pretty severe water availability situations, it seems like, through crop insurance and the like, at least on the agriculture side, folks were finding ways of coping with the drought to kind of alleviate pain points. And just curious if that's something that you guys found in your interviews, or if you kind of see additional pain points kind of brewing as, you know, water demands increase and the supply situation kind of remains the same or gets more challenging. So it's kind of a big, broad question. Hope that I hope you can go somewhere with that, but it would be just fascinating given all the discussions you had with all these different water managers, if you got some insights into those areas.
So yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I'll start with that last point because I think it is a critical point. I mean, I think that there is a great deal of buffering, in particular in agriculture, at least on the U.S. side, regarding drought at this point. This is something that's not unique to this study. I've been doing the same, similar kinds of work within many agricultural communities in Oklahoma, and it's a very similar situation where the pain that people are feeling when it comes to extreme drought can really be limited in the agricultural context by the crop insurance system. I have you know, long discussed and thought about sort of the issues of sort of experiential learning that come out of that, given that there were generations and generations of farmers who did not have crop insurance, and they suffered and adapted to drought, to address drought, to respond to drought, and to prepare for drought in a way that may or may not be occurring to the same extent today because of the sort of buffering mechanisms. So it's both a good thing and a bad thing, right? Long-term sustainability might be kind of undermined because of the nature of things like crop insurance. But everybody suffers through a drought. So crop insurance is not, it's not a substitute for, you know, the income that you would have had from you know, an actual full crop coming in. Everybody suffers through that. In terms of urban spaces, it really depends on what the infrastructure is, but there are, you know, many of them, again, have really adapted, at least on the U.S. side, to have an enormous amount of extra water. One of the quotes, because I knew I'd run over way too long in this talk, one of the quotes that I cut out was an extensive interview that we did with a municipal water manager talking about having bought water from, you know, bought basically land which came with water rights in an area that was very distant from that particular city. And the person said, we have no interest in taking that water because basically that land then will dry up and be completely useless. The only way we would take it is under duress, and we have to have that in our basically investment profile. And so, you know, that it seems like there's a lot of the water market that's providing that kind of buffering for municipalities, at least.
And so, and I would add a few things. So you might not have had a chance to, it might not have been very visible in our, when we gave our sample of questions, which of course there were a lot more questions we explored with people. But you know, a very key question was, you know, so when you experienced drought, how did you have to adapt? What did you have to do to get through? You know, and what was that like? And so we tried to, whether it was a farmer or somebody with a professional role as a water manager. And so part of that was to find out, you know, what, not only the effects, but how do people respond? What do they have available to them? Whether it's this sort of wiggle room or it's crop insurance or it's something else. So hoping that in the you know, the further products that come out, that there'll be some more exploration of that. But you know, because there's technological issues, there's people focusing on things like there's this new movement or recent movement to focus on soil health in agriculture, and you know, we were able to talk to some farmers that have been doing that and reducing their not only water consumption, but actually improving the economics of their operation, which is what, you know, everyone wants. And the other thing is, I think it's very regionally distinct, but in some ways, but also depends on why people are farming. So in northern New Mexico and parts of southern Colorado, there's a lot of farming going on. It's maybe not the major livelihood of the people, but it's very important to them in other ways. And it's very important to them to you know, keep their water rights tied to that land. It's very much valued as part of the social and cultural fabric and historical fabric. So those kinds of things also affect how people respond and what kind of pain they felt. You know, how they felt the pain. That's an example where people want to see, for instance, actually, I don't think I was anywhere where anyone tied to the land wanted to see water rights separated from the land, no matter what scale. But I mean, the questions come up in different ways, and I think the pain is either felt or anticipated in different ways. So I think it's really important to look at that, the question that you raised.
Yeah, what are the follow-up questions that we actually have to that question about how did you respond to it, or what did you do, or what happened to you? Because we also ask who suffers most. In other words, it's not just about that person who might have a very clear way of narrativizing the pain that they felt, but we asked everybody, you know, who else suffered and how did they suffer. It was interesting to see comments then that forced people to think about their community rather than just thinking about the impacts on themselves. And we often had much more expansive and I think sometimes more thoughtful answers to that rather than just technical answers, which could be, you know, well, we've done this and this and this to address issues of drought or prepare for or during a drought.
And something just quickly to keep in mind is that we think of things like, you know, the difficulty of farming, for instance, just talking about ag use, but what also can happen is you can find shifts in who's farming and what kind of farming they're doing. So if smaller or less capitalized farmers are having a hard time, then what you can find historically, and I think there's some evidence of it here, is the people, those that are better capitalized, that have the resources, are things like buy land or rent land, or, you know, increase their land holdings, and they have the resources to wait it through till the conditions are better, or to invest in better technology. So it can also just kind of shift what's going on in ways that may or may not be great criteria for what's good management.
Thank you, guys. It's really helpful.
All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I just wanted to thank our presenters for sharing the information with us today. And folks, if you have additional questions or follow-up, please feel free to contact us, and we'll try to get you in touch with the right people. I wanted to thank everybody again for attending the webinar today. We did record it, and so we'll get that up on the internet for folks to share if you need to. And with that, thank you again, and we will hope everybody has a good afternoon.